As you all know, I am Lisa Brush with the Stewardship Network, and I'm really pleased to be here with Sarah Jaquette Ray, who wrote a field guide to climate anxiety, and is also a professor and author as well. So we'll give you a little bit of intro here, and then we'll turn it over to a conversation with Sarah. Laura, good to see you here as well. For those of you who do not know, the Stewardship Network is a 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to protect, equip, and mobilize people and organizations to care for land and water in their communities. So we are the capacity builders that provide the backbone support for you all to soar outside and do stewardship and ecological restoration and networking and learning and engagement and learning about how to be in the natural world and care for it and each other. We have over thousands and thousands of different partners. We're a national and international award-winning organization for revolutionizing the way that land and water is cared for in their communities. And as you all know, partnerships are the name of the game in the Stewardship Network. So we do collaborations with all volunteer nonprofits to global NGOs, municipal, state, federal, and tribal governments, funding sources, consultants and contractors, federal agencies, you all name it, we partner with you all, and really just love the work that we get to do with you all out in the world. We have our member communities, so our collaborative conservation communities that operate, they're place-based, and they're locally defined and controlled, and they're made up of everybody that cares for land and water in their communities. And so the cool thing that we do is you can have a member community in your community, but then we link those communities together to learn from each other and share and accelerate the work that they do, and in their generous collaboration and distributed leadership. I want to thank you all online who are also financial contributors to the network. You have enabled us to continue to do these free online monthly webcasts during the second Wednesday of every month. So if you're new to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast, you can put a recurring calendar invite in your own calendar for the second Wednesday during the Eastern time zone's noon hour, so 9 a.m. on the West Coast. But I really want to thank you all for your financial support. That enables us to continue to do these as we have for the past 20 plus years. So thank you so much for your financial contributions. As I said, I'm Lisa Brush, and I'm here with Sarah Jaquette Ray, and looking forward to the conversation, Sarah.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me. And it's so nice to see all these names showing up and these locations showing up, and to think of the ways that being on a Zoom webinar like this has enabled all these connections to people across the country. So that's so great. I'm in Arcata, California, calling in from the land of the Twiat peoples, and it's redwood country up here. So it's a beautiful morning.
Nice. We've had lovely snow here in Southeast Michigan. So Sarah, it's been fun. We've had a chance to be together over the last couple of months as we did a Facebook Live thing in December, right?
Yep.
And then you presented at the conference a week and a half ago. So tell us a little bit more about what you've been working on over the past year plus, and kind of the work that you do with young adults. And
yeah, so the sort of story for how I got into thinking about climate anxiety and the emotional register of how people who are engaged in work like you all are engaged in environmental work and climate advocacy, and specifically as the climate movement and environmental movement has started to join forces with the environmental justice and the climate justice movements, I've been noticing that young people coming into, so I teach environmental studies and I'm chair of the department. And when I first started that job, started teaching and sharing in environmental studies programs over 10 years ago, there wasn't a huge emotional register to what we were doing in the class. We would just teach stuff and students would go home and it was all just fine and get their degree and whatever. And then about 6 or so years ago, I noticed that increasingly the content of the classes and the students' ability to kind of cope with the content they were learning was getting worse and worse. And in particular, I would teach, my interest is in environmental justice. And so I would teach the intersection between environmental degradation and social injustice. And this was just, it was one thing for students to come in knowing that polar bears were getting threatened. It was another thing entirely to see that that was connected to all of these other rippling out effects that had to do with human impact. And it was just for students who weren't themselves going through climate trauma or experiencing the effects of climate change themselves, it was overwhelming. And then increasingly students started to feel climate change themselves. And here I am in California where they're really starting. I mean, we started off this semester with students actually in fire situations trying to get connected through Zoom, and it was pretty intense. And so the increased prevalence of climate anxiety and climate trauma and environmental grief, or whatever some of the words are that are surrounding this, has been really intense in classes, and really intense for me, actually. And so I turned my research to thinking about my question that I try to answer in the book is, what is it that young people and we all need in order to engage in this work for the long haul? Because we are burning out, and even some students and some people go into more levels of denial after they've come out into the open. They got to go back in, some cognitive dissonance there, and some apathy sometimes, and certainly nihilism. And I think that there's a background level of depression and anxiety, especially among young people, that really concern me as an instructor. And so I turn my energies and my attention and my passions towards what are the sort of emotional outcomes, or what are the emotional tools that young people need in order to do this work. So that's what I've been thinking about for some time.
And so what are you finding?
Yeah, so at first I kind of thought, talking to all my colleagues in environmental work, they would, as many of you probably are familiar with, you spend a lot of time at, the famous Aldo Leopold quote about if you're involved in environmental work, you're always heartbroken. And there's a sense of, this is just the par for the course. If you're doing environmental work, you're prepared, or you're dealing with emotional grief and mourning and loss all the time. And I think that increasingly folks like Ashley Consolo and Susan Clayton and all kinds of sort of psychologist scholars have been noticing and tracking environmental grief, and a lot of science researchers, and that's been really interesting to make use of. But the question became for me was, how do we take that research and pair it up with what we're doing in environmental classes? And many environmental educators don't focus on emotions of their students. And in general, the Western style of education is to ask students to come into the class and to leave their emotional selves at the door and just bring in their minds, and that the mind and the intellect are the things that are going to solve all these problems the most. And could they please go to counseling and psychology services for the emotional stuff? And we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater in the classroom. We've forgotten that the rocket fuel for learning and the rocket fuel for activism and advocacy is emotions. And so I've really turned towards looking at all of the roles of different types of emotions, like anger, grief, despair, climate anxiety, all kinds of negative emotions, but also positive emotions that we associate with things like pleasure and desire and joy, and what the role of those emotions are in our attention to the problems and our ability to get up and do the work. And so what I found is that it's extremely important to have what I call in the book climate wisdom, awareness of emotions in engaging us to do the work, in helping us take care of ourselves so that we can keep doing the work. Because there's a sort of burnout culture, there's a performance of busyness. And if I really care about something, then I will burn out from working on it. And then that will be the only testament to how much I care about it, is if I expend myself on the cause. And it turns out that there's all kinds of evidence for why that's not a good idea. And also thinking about, how it is that the news that we consume affects our emotions, or how it is that relationships with other people affects our emotions, or how it is that the stories that we live in affect our emotions, how important emotions are as opposed to data or information to our decision making. Risk perception theory is super interesting to me. So all of these sort of the research that's happening on emotions and how we engage in environmental justice work is just super rich. And it seems to me like the key to unlock a lot of problems that we're having.
Right. Yeah, it is. I mean, that's the thing that we always talk about with the network, is you have to bring your whole authentic self. So,
yeah.
So Sarah, talk to us a little bit more about risk perception theory.
Yeah, so the thing about climate change that's super interesting, and so for my focus is really climate change, and so This could potentially relate to the various environmental concerns that your audience
Yep.
members are engaged in. But for me, I love Anthony Leiserowitz's work from the Yale Climate Center for Communication, or the YCC. And he talks a lot about risk perception because he worked under Paul Slovic. And I went to graduate school with him and I sort of idolized him. So I was following what he was doing and paying attention to Paul Slovic's work. And my thinking is that, or their thinking is that climate change is a problem that defies risk perception. And what I mean by that is that all the things that human beings in general perceive as risks, there are certain traits that those risks that we perceive carry. Like, for example, if something is something that we don't voluntarily sign up for, then we tend to fear it more. If something has a malicious face to it, we tend to fear it more. So there's certain qualities that the threats that we perceive have to have in order for us to perceive them as a threat. And climate change is just simply doesn't check any of those boxes. So there's the sense of climate change being the wicked problem that no one's ever going to care about because it just can't show up as a scary thing. And so I think it's quite astonishing that climate change has taken as much center stage in recent years as it has. And it suggests to me that something else is happening. And when you look at the work of risk perception folks, one of the things that they say is that the people how do people come to perceive a risk? Well, they come to perceive a risk as two things. It used to be just one thing, but now there's two things that Slovic and his colleagues are discovering. They perceive something to be a risk if they can physically in their bodies feel it. Okay, and so increasingly people are feeling the proxies or the secondary effects of climate change. For example, we can't physically perceive climate change because the temporal scale is too long, but we can feel things like rising sea levels, and we can feel things in our bodies like increased temperatures, and we can feel things like pandemics, for example.
Exactly.
Just another example.
Right.
Right, and we can feel things like environmental injustice and increased air pollution. So there are things our bodies can feel, and there is success happening in the communication world where people are able to draw the connections, to connect the dots between what they're bodily perceiving and climate change and the story of climate change. So there's some success happening there. And the second thing is whoever the messenger is. And so it turns out that the number one, especially in this moment of intense polarization in America, people are starting to realize that the ways that people are making decisions about what they care about has to do with who they're believing, who their messengers are. And so if you had someone on Fox News talking about climate change, it turned out Paul Slovic did this work with weather forecasters, that local news weather forecasters were his target. He was like, people trust weather news forecasters, so I am going to get weather news forecasters to start talking about climate change. So the messenger is super important, is as important as anything. So these are some of the things that I'm finding that I love about risk perception. The availability heuristic, which is some of the scholarship around this about the availability bias, talks about how people are more likely to perceive something to be a problem if they can recently conjure up an image of it. And so the power of image, the power of Hollywood media, the power of news channels in shaping our perception of risk and therefore our actions that we're going to take is extraordinary. And it would be very, very helpful if we became more aware of that and more critical of that. Because and also the fact that there's an optimism bias in human nature, that we simply refuse to take seriously the models that are forecasting what's going to happen with climate change because we have an optimism bias. I'm reading a great book right now called The Optimist Telescope that talks about all the science of this. And it's just, I never thought I would get so into the psychology stuff, but it seems to be so relevant, right? So if we want to really get people to care about things and really want people to engage in stuff for the long haul, the key to that is going to be understanding the emotional connection that people have to the issues.
Yeah. So so talk to us a little bit about how, so you teach environmental studies, and then as you started to do this research, you did kind of dive into the psychological aspects of us as human beings, and as we face these crises, whether it's climate or other things, right? Other traumas in our lives.
Yeah. So I mean, the dominant model in American culture is to be afraid of or not see value in negative emotions. And so when we are despairing or we think there's something wrong with the world, we think there's something wrong with us, right? The other traditional model in American culture is to individualize the problem, right? That I have some pathology or I have something wrong with me. I have to adjust myself to this screwed up world. And that is something that many young people, I think, come to believe, and it takes um, some, there's so much work that has to be done against the dominant messages to get young people to realize, no, if you're feeling awful, then you're having an appropriate response to what's going on in the world.
Mhm.
And the default isn't happiness, regardless of what the founding fathers have, said, right? So this notion that we may want to get rid of happiness as the model, as the sort of default expectation, and actually embrace despair and loneliness and all of the other emotions that we're all going through as a portal to some kind of really important work, or as an indicator or signal or instructions for where to go next, if we can figure out some tools about that. To really see grief and anxiety as an indicator of something very important that's telling us something that we need to know and pursue, that we won't feel so pathological or so shameful about our negative emotions. And I think once we normalize grief and normalize anxiety around these real problems, there's the opportunity for transformation. There's the opportunity to think about, okay, what is the other side of grief? Well, the other side of grief is love and fear of, and grief is just a proxy feeling for the love that we have for the natural world and for the human relationship with the natural world, and the feeling of that being under threat, right? And so if we can focus in the research, there's mindfulness stuff around this, the science of happiness stuff around this, that if we can focus our attention on cultivating and making sure we're protecting that which we love, it gives us a sense of empowerment and efficacy over something we can control, which is extremely important for a sense of well-being and being able to be okay in the world, rather than just be beset by the grief, which tends to often lead to kind of a sense of immobilization or inaction. And so while those negative feelings are very important, they also need to be a portal to some sort of transformation. And yeah, the grief and the despair are reasonable responses, but they can't just end there.
Right. So talk to us a little bit about how do you walk through that portal? How do you access that portal when you're in that state of grief and feeling somewhat immobilized?
Yeah, right. So you map it out. I mean, this is what I do, right? After all this research, I'm thinking, okay, every day I'm doing this, right? There's many things you can do, but one thing you can do is map out what are all the things that are triggering this for you, what are triggering all the forms of grief and worry, and try to figure out, well, what is that a sign? This is sort of a like a self-investigation, right? What is it a sign of what I love, right? What is it that I'm loving that I'm afraid is under threat? And then you say, what are the things I can do to try to protect or cultivate that thing's health or that thing's thriving? And sometimes it is as simple as, I need to brush my teeth more often. It can actually be, I had a student one time who I asked to do action in place to make them all feel better, right? They said, okay, find some action you can do. We're gonna have a whole semester assignment around action. There's a lot of discussion about action as the antidote to anxiety. So, but that's, how do you get from anxiety to action is what I think you're asking. And I find that to be the interesting question too, right? Like, what if you're so depressed you can't do action? What do you do then?
Right.
And how do you know what action to do? And what's a big enough action? And I'm too small and I feel, disempowered in the scale of the problem, and just saving my, not using disposable plastic bags, it doesn't feel like enough. And there's a sense of, that's just not adequate enough. Action is not, it needs to be more specific, and there needs to be a path for why that particular action is going to solve my particular problems, So I want to be more nuanced about that. But if you can figure out the thing that over which you have control, and that can be an action that you can do right now, some of that has to do with not being overwhelmed by the scale of the problem, and to break down the actions into steps that can be done right now. What can I do right now? And I did have this one student who I had students doing volunteer work and cleanup things and restoration things and volunteering all over, the community, and doing really what I consider external actions. And then I had this one student who did a 30-day mindfulness exercise, where one of them involved like brushing her teeth with her other hand. And I just remember thinking, that doesn't count. Wait, hang on, that's not what I meant by action, And then I had to really investigate my assumptions.
Right. Maybe. Right.
And she really challenged me to think, oh yeah, actually, for many of us, sometimes at some point in our lives, sometimes the action is going to be something as basic as, the only thing I can do right now
is brush my
is
teeth.
brush my teeth.
Right. And I'm going to try to give it a little bit of mindfulness, and I'm going to try to remember how I do that with my opposite hand. Yeah.
Well, and I was just talking to some young people who are working on something called the Climate Journal Project. I really recommend folks look it up, and they're trying to do a Kickstarter campaign. And so go donate some money to them. They're trying to do that by the 20th. But there's some young folks, young people, Yvonne and Elena, who I was chatting with yesterday, and I'm hoping to do a podcast interview with them. And their argument is that they want to use journaling as a climate action. The sense of overwhelm that young people feel around Earth Day or whatever, around all the actions you can take and sign this petition, and this is a problem, and fix this, and the sort of urgency, get people to act urgency trope that we see in so much environmental discourse. She just decided she couldn't handle it. I mean, it was overloading her. And so she decided she was going to take a very different tack. And she started this company called the Climate Journal Project that's all about, the way she described it when she opened up her introduction to me blew my mind, but I couldn't describe it any better. She said, if we cannot be present and grateful every single day for our presence in our lives, then we can't do that work. And the work will become a byproduct indirectly of doing that work. And I thought, if you're at 26 can be this wise, we're going to be okay. You know?
Yeah, exactly. So talk a little bit. So, and maybe Rob, maybe you can find that online, and somebody can, or at least somebody else online can drop that link in the chat for folks to explore that a little more. And then the other thing that I think about with the climate stuff that's so hard is that just the feeling of I'm not doing enough. I'm not doing enough. I need to do this. I need to do this. And the idea that there's a part of it that I'd love your thoughts on this. The idea of climate commitment as opposed to climate action.
I love that. And I think that at least marries a sense of there's something about my own well-being that has to also be taken into consideration while I do this work. So you conjured up another one of Paul Slovik's research projects that I wanted to bring up. I obviously think that his work is really relevant and important for climate action. So he and his colleagues expanded on the child in the pond psychology scenario, where they discovered that I'm going to get to the apathy question, the sort of like, I'm too small on the scale of things. Yeah. How do I work around that? What's the solution to that problem? And there's a whole chapter in my book on this. And I just think it's just fascinating because of course this is daunting for everybody, but particularly young people who feel like they have no power in the situation. Right. So the child in the pond scenario that they expanded on, and his research colleagues, is that when a human being walks past a child drowning in a pond, they're very likely to try to rescue the child. Mm-hmm. But if they see a child drowning in the pond in front of them, and they also see another child drowning in the pond farther away, they're actually less likely to try to save either child. And the conclusion there is that the bigger the problem, the bigger we perceive the problem to be, the less likely we're going to do anything, because the negative feelings of not being able to solve all the problems outweigh the positive feelings of being able to solve a little bit of the problem.
Right.
And so, I mean, this is mind-blowing, right? Like, what does this mean for climate action? We're trying to save the whole planet.
Exactly. That's why I was talking about the climate commitment. And so it's like, it's okay. It's okay if you're not constantly acting in this regard. Make the long-term commitment and do it. And we'll,
yes,
like,
and
talk it out.
This goes to, in my book, and what I think we really need to be thinking about is a critique of American individualism, which is that many of us think, well, of course I can't single-handedly make a difference. It's what Slovik and his colleagues called the drop in the bucket imaginary. Of course I can't. I'm just a drop in the bucket. I can't fix anything. And if I personally were from a different culture that saw action and collectivity, which I'm imagining there are people listening who are from those cultures. I'm thinking here about, many indigenous cultures, and one of the reasons why people attribute the successes of the pandemic in China to different cultural values. Right. There's a sense of, from my cultural perspective, of course, as one individual, I can't make an impact. So why would I even try? And that kind of individualism is designed to disempower us. It's a form of what some scholars call learned helplessness or learned powerlessness, that we learn that we don't have any power, so we don't even try. We see ourselves as individuals acting in concert with a whole movement. And this is where I love Paul Hawkins' book, The Blessed Unrest, and some other scholars' work where they try to lift up and show the amount of people who are doing this work. Rebecca Solnit's work is really good at doing this. The sense of being part of a larger concert of people doing this work so that we can take a rest if we need to. There are still people singing in the choir. Well, my break won't stop the whole song. There's a real liberation to that, a real sense of empowerment if you see yourself as acting in a large group, and then we can say to ourselves, we'll do what we can. If we see ourselves in a story, and this is Joanna Macy's argument when she talks about the stories of now, you either are operating in a story where there's a great unraveling happening and the coming anarchy. And this is kind of a lot of environmental discourse, especially, we see this in David Wallace Wells' book, and a lot of doom and gloom apocalyptic narratives, which are not scientifically incorrect, but they have the effect, if you study story, of actually making people feel less empowered, less likely to engage, more defeated. And if we live in a story of, as Joanna Macy calls it, the Great Turning, she talks about the Great Turning is this collective of people who is amassing and doing all this underground work to turn things around, and something is about to be born. We're not in a tomb, we're in a womb, right? Something is happening that's bringing forward a new world. And I think the discourse that's happening is just a recent article today in Grist magazine about what's this new world going to be like. We're going to have to change a new economy, an indigenized economy, a new story, the power of new story in our new world. And this ushering on, Arundhati Roy calls it the portal, the pandemic as a portal, this notion that this is a portal, we're entering into something new. Do we have the courage to welcome this new thing and change everything that we know? What will that mean for all of us? And I think those of us who've been doing this work for some time are really excited about that. I mean, scared too, but excited about these prospects. We've been seeing the failings of the existing system for some time. So can we redefine the story that we've been living in? Are we in the middle of a great turning? How does that make us feel about engaging in the work? Well, it certainly completely makes this notion of my drop in the bucket imaginary of my individual self just irrelevant, right? Like,
exactly, right?
Who cares, And Clarissa Esses, who's a poet who's written this great, wonderful poem that I know Laura Schmidt, who's one of my colleagues in the Great Good Grief Network, she has it in her tagline, her emails, and she frequently says it wherever we go. And I love this quote from the poem is called "We Were Made for These Times" or something like that. And there's a line there that says, the best thing we can do is to reach out to what we can touch and work on that. And so whatever was within, and psychologists will talk about work on what you have control over. Figure out what you have control over, and that's your domain of that's your sphere of influence. That's where you have power, and not worry about, I can't change the president's mind. I can't change, not worry about all the stuff you don't have control over, because there is so much you can do in the realm of which you do have control.
It's a welcome to the Stewardship Network, right?
Yeah.
That's what we're all about. That's exactly it. And that's part of why I was starting it, because there are so many people out there doing so many amazing things. And to be connected to them and to know those stories, to hear those stories of you all online right now who are doing the work. And it is, I've been doing this for 20 plus years and I love it. I love it every day, because people who are making
the best way you can, and the best antidote to what ails us is community and connection.
Right.
So if the illness of what's happening on the planet is disconnection and alienation from each other and from other non-human life, then the antidote is connection. The antidote is a recognition of intra-being, as the Buddhists call it, right? Or indigenous folks understand that as, this animism that exists everywhere. Some scholars talk about transcorporeality or vibrant matter, that everything around us is alive, and what happens if we reorient our ethics around that. I'm thinking about Robin Wall Kimmerer's work here too, where she talks about the honorable harvest as an ethical way of being in the world. And my feeling is that the media, unfortunately, the 24/7 media stream that we get wants to tell us a particular story because we have a negativity bias psychologically in our minds. That's the reptilian brain that is constantly trying to search for our maintain our survival. So it's not our fault, but the media reflects that back at us because that's where the eyeballs go. Yep. And we have to actively work against that. And I'm really acknowledging now the work of folks like the Solutions Journalism Network. I really appreciate what they're doing. Ellen Kelsey's work on, she does a contagious stories of hope kind of thing, where she does the hashtag ocean optimism, stories of things that are happening in the ocean. There's a real sense of awareness happening in the environmental movement that is, if we don't see all the solutions happening, not only will we feel alone and disempowered and therefore not do anything, but we also not know how to do the fixing. We need to see that stuff modeled. We need to follow in the footsteps of people who are doing this work. We need to take notes and see if we can scale that over to where we are, and oh, they had success there, maybe we can do it that way over here. And we frankly need to feel like we're not alone. I mean, that is truly
well, and one of the things that I've always said, I've got these little things that over the 20 plus years that I always say, and one of them is that we're all connected. I've been saying that, and then I'm like, all right, people, see, we actually are all connected. All of us.
I mean, the pandemic, I really hope the pandemic brings that more mainstream,
Yeah.
It's not just woo-woo. It's not just the woo-woo environmentalists that are trying to say that, it's like, yeah. And I'm not trying to laugh about the pandemic at all. I'm gravely serious, but I hope that what it makes people realize is that this notion that we can do this stuff to the environment and contain it elsewhere and not have it affect us, I hope that the hubris around that is becoming more acknowledged. Yeah. And there are consequences. You can't externalize eternally.
Yep. So let me ask you a question. Then I want to go to a couple of questions in the chat. But one of the things that I think about, so I want to go back to the beginning part of the conversation where you were talking about, I'm just an individual person. I'm young. I don't have experience. I can't act. I can't do it. I also want to, Rob, maybe you can put in the chat the keynote speakers from our conference, because everybody should check out Mamie Parker's. If you're feeling that way, watch Mamie Parker's keynote address, because that's exactly what she talks about, is stepping in and stepping up. And the other thing that I will, there is also the whole idea, the quote that people would say is, if you're not scared, you're not growing. And there have been times in this journey where I'm like, okay, I would like to stop learning right now. I would like to be a little less afraid. Like, I'm so far out on a limb, and sometimes the view is beautiful, and sometimes I'm holding on for dear life in the wind, blowing out.
Of course, yeah.
But one of the other things that I think about in terms of the approach and where we are right now is the idea that we actually really do need us all to show up. We do, and we do need to be the choir. So you take a rest and take a break when you need to take that, but also we do need everybody. And I think our problems now are these wicked problems where we don't have a single sole answer to that. In terms of there's one expert on high who's going to tell us all how to solve this issue. That we really do need everybody to show up and chime in and make suggestions and efforts. And so I think that collaborative nature of solving these wicked problems also really creates space at the table for everybody, for people with decades of experience and people those brand new to the field. And so I don't know if you can speak a little bit to that. But
yeah, I mean, I think what you're asking for is what's the inspiration for young people to get involved in the life of this work. And, I'm so fortunate that I work only with students who have self-selected into wanting to figure out how to do a life of this work. And it's really quite astonishing that overwhelmingly in this generation, the generation that's like 18 to 24 right now, the concern around climate change is unprecedentedly high. And so you can find this data on, again, the Yale climate, their biannual report called Climate Change in the American Mind. And they've been doing a decade of data collection around about the 6 different Americas and the different concerns around climate change. And they've noticed that the amount of people who are hostile to climate change is something like 7%. It's actually not very big. They're just very loud and organized and they have a lot of money behind them. But the amount of people that have gone from sort of not really sort of indifferent and only maybe marginally caring about it to seriously concerned or alarmed is really high. So people are moving on that spectrum quite a bit. And the younger generation is to account for a lot of that. And that's across party lines, which is really interesting. So there's a real, to me, what I find encouraging is that young people are already caring about this. And so the care is not the issue. And I think when we're dealing with environmental education, my generation was taught that our job is to try to get people to care. And that's sort of the mantra. How do we get people to care? But that's no longer the issue. And if we keep trying to use that hammer to deal with the problem, we're gonna miss an opportunity. And so the new question is, where do we plug the energy? How do we keep people feeling empowered? How do we also keep them resourced for their lives so they don't jump off a cliff of despair and burnout at some point. And so those kinds of existential questions, those are, I consider existential questions, need to become something we're more adept at helping young people understand and grapple with. But the question, to go back to the question of how do they plug in, there are all kinds of organized youth movements right now around climate change and environmental things. The Sunrise movement is all about going local. So I think one of the sources of disempowerment is this feeling of needing to act at a global scale. And the Sunrise movement has countered that by basically saying, no, everything's going to be at a local scale, and anyone could do anything at a local scale. So if you look at just what's happening around you, whatever big global problem you care about, there is some local manifestation or a place that can be worked at a local level. And these things, like Adrienne Maree Brown's beautiful book, Emergent Strategy, which is another one of my, the Bibles of my thinking right now. She basically talks about everything being kind of rhizomatic, that she talks about the ocean in a drop, right? That there's a granular and the cosmic, there's a connection there, that when we participate in that work, the ripple out effect of how that affects other people and gets other people involved and changes things in immeasurable ways. You can feel like you're only doing an impact at a local scale, but you have just no idea, and you can't measure how broad or how scaled out that impact is. And so the argument I make is go for the thing that's right in front of you.
Yeah. The other thing that I also love about it is do what's good for you. So if you're a fighter and a screamer, go protest, go.
There's no right way.
Right. Yes. Don't call all the legislators. If you're an artist, make this stuff irresistible, Yes. And if you're a cook, cook. And so you don't have to do what's
not. It's so interesting you should say that, because I had a young woman interview me about this stuff, and she said, I've gone this way. I want to go into climate psychology, but my best friend, she's opened a bakery and she used to care about this stuff, and now she's kind of given up and she's opened a bakery, and I feel bad. I regret this. And I thought to myself, no, right. She's opening a bakery. Somebody has to do the baking, right? Like, I mean, there's a part of this, and somebody has to fuel our tummies and our hearts and keep us feeling. There's always the role of the people who are doing the caretaking, right? I mean, it's a gendered notion, unfortunately, that still exists in many activist circles, that the caregiving isn't itself an instrumental part of the work. And so who's making the music? Who's taking care of the babies while this is all happening? Who's caring for the elderly while this is all happening? The care work is necessary. The social reproduction required is the point. If we're going to be fighting a force that's killing us and we die doing it, that is not the point. That's right? Not the point, right? We risk both. Yep. So what we're fighting, the world that we want to fight for, we have to protect and manifest in our daily lives. And if that world involves joy, and if that world involves music and art and dance and pleasure, and if that world involves multi-generations, helping each other out, then we need to make sure we're protecting that in the action, right? In the process and the journey of it. And yeah, I mean, I feel like what you're describing about, do what you're passionate about. There's a role for all of that stuff. And in a chapter in my book, I talk about find your calling. And as a program leader for environmental studies, I'm often feeling pressure from administration to tailor all of my curriculum around the marketable skill sets, the things that will get students jobs, and create environmental studies into a job track, right? Like, there's no environmental studies-ist job career, right? There's an environmental scientist job career or a biologist job career, but there's no studies-ist job career. And I sort of strongly reject the notion that there's going to be one career path, especially in this existing economy, which we know is dying, right? So do we want, the many, many, many possible skills of the resilient future that we're going to need to train for? I'm not going to circumscribe it by saying there's any one particular direction. There's no one path for this, and it may or may not be paid,
Right, exactly. And the other thing that I often talk about for all of us is the whole idea, and it's a quote that I use often, and I heard it from Steve Jobs, but I don't know if he originated it, but is that you can only connect the dots backwards. Right? So we have a desire, especially when we're younger, like you say, what's my track? What am I going to do that's going to move me along this path of life and get me to some goal that I think I want? And he said you can only connect the dots backwards.
Yeah. So you never know.
Love that. Yeah.
And you don't, you can't have it prescribed for you too. I mean, I have to spend the first couple of years as students undoing what their parents and
Right.
the
The
culture has
educational
been
system,
telling them.
yeah, right? Yeah.
And they get mad. Why is it that, I don't really know if I believe you, Sarah, because all these other people, why would they have told me the wrong things?
I know, or the whole idea that, oh, we could go into that. So let me ask you a question from the chat here first. So a couple different ones that are about. I'm going to read you two questions at once, right? So
Okay.
Emily asks about a situation one should supposedly have control over, but it doesn't seem like it. Cutting back on plastic products, CAFO produced food, etc. It's a difficult thing in any case, and it's harder in the current pandemic. This basically, the impact of personal choices is the main worry for me. So again, the thing that we've been talking about. What would you recommend as to how to cope, act, or how much of each to do? And then let me ask a similar kind of question.
Okay.
I don't know what the general demographic is here, but I'm 25. I have a background in ecology and biology, and I definitely struggle with the sense of dread and self-agency where this is the way the world is. How am I supposed to do something about this when I'm still living at home and I don't have a real job? I wonder if you have any exercises that would help with managing that feeling. So that's from Alexandria. Thanks for sharing that.
Oh, wow. Oh, I feel like going offline and just talking to y'all for a couple hours.
Right?
Sorry, I'll try to not do that right now. So this question of how do I reduce my personal impact? So that person, Emily, or others here may have done the ecological footprint exercise, which the point of that exercise is to render us, and this, even if you've never done it, the fossil fuel industry has done a really, really good job of making us think that the solution to these environmental problems is through individual consumer choices. And when I do this exercise with students about, what are the kinds of actions that could make a difference? Something like 90% of the things that they come up with are in the category of consumer actions. And so it reveals to me that they see themselves as only individuals acting, and they see themselves even as individuals, that the limited notion of their identity and their power is as a consumer. And so my suggestion around that is that the framework that gets you to feeling this way is bogus, and it renders you disempowered. It's precisely designed to make you feel like it's not going to make a difference. And so what I worry about with young people is that they've been told for so long that they have to reduce their impact to the point of nihilism, right? I mean, to the point of, I have a student and she's written about it publicly on my blog, and a final paper in her class was interrogating her own eating disorders around these environmental imperatives to reduce your impact and take up less space on the planet. And she just couldn't, every consumer choice she made was fraught with all kinds of agony.
And paralyzing, I can imagine.
She just stopped.
Right.
She would have an anxiety attack every time she went to the store. So this sense of internalizing this anxiety and I'm thinking about Michel Foucault's work on disciplining your bodies, right? We discipline our bodies as a way to deal with all this angst, and we individualize and turn it inward and basically try to reduce our impact until we vanish, right? And I don't want to spell out where I'm going with that, but that kind of nihilism is truly not what the planet needs. And so I would suggest a complete reframing. You're asking for something more concrete, and I'm giving you something maybe harder and kind of bigger to do, but a reframing of impact, right? Okay, so I'm trying to, you've swallowed this mission of this environmental mantra to reduce your impact. What if you turn that around and increase your impact?
Right.
And so what's the positive impact you can increase? So, reframe it as a positive thing. Where are the places I can have impact? I want to have a big impact. Right? So what's that positive impact going to be? And to go to the kind of personal individual choices thing, I think in addition to the fact that the fossil fuels invested in us thinking that way, and our individual society has taught us to feel that way, and you may not, no matter what I say here, you may not be able to let it go. And I understand that it's so deeply.
Just fight it. Just keep pushing against it.
Just keep pushing against it. And frankly, dollar for dollar, the best investment that we can put into making sure we can handle what's coming in the future is not around these kinds of things. It actually turns out to be around building community. So if you can invest in making your relationships, building trust with people, this is why frankly, the huge movement towards mutual aid, and mutual aid is virtual, it's online in the pandemic. There's so much need. And it's not paid. That's the point. It's extra market. It was outside the market, you know. The idea there with mutual aid is to create, you know, to try to use the pandemic to create this other type of economy whereby the people who have the money don't also get the most protection from these problems. And so I would suggest, first of all, complete rejection of this reducing impact model. I much prefer Robin Wall Kimmerer's notion of the honorable harvest as a way to think about that. This is about gifts and about relationships and being full and abundance. This isn't about reduction and, you know, shrinking yourself down. And then to really to reprioritize community building and relationship building. What is one thing that you can do today to build a relationship or to build trust or to create a network or to reach out to somebody and help somebody out? Because the solution to these problems is not going to just come from up top. Resilience for climate problems and climate traumas and disasters and that sort of thing is entirely in community. And there's research on this too that you can look up. It's not just woo-woo, nice feeling stuff. So
yeah, so I like that. So that whole idea of just flip the equation, right? and it takes practice, right? So changing our mindsets takes practice. So just understand that as you do that. And then Alexandria also asks, so as a sometimes environmental educator, so I think you just hit on this too, but just again, how can I better facilitate the self-awareness in others that taking these small steps to care for yourself and in your environment are valuable, even though it's scary and it's big? So one of the things that I say about that too, and it's the whole thing, I used to do this public education campaign about small actions make a big difference. You know, there is that just idea that you have agency as an individual, and you can make yourself bigger and more impactful by building those relationships.
I would go again, because I'm an academic, I go right to the assumptions of it, right? Like, so is the reason that we do actions in the world, this is kind of a philosophical question, is the reason that we do actions in the world because we need to see the result of it? Is it instrumentalist? So in the book, I talk about the myth of instrumentalism, that, you know, do we have to see the results of our actions to make it feel like they matter? What is the need that we're fulfilling in ourselves to do those actions? And that is an investigation in and of itself. What do we need to know in order to feel like it's valuable work? And when I did that with myself, I realized, no, I don't really need to see the results of my actions. As teachers of all people know that they will never, in any assessment at the end of the year or any thank you letters at the end of the year, they will never know the impacts they've made on people for those people's entire lives, and then the ripple out effect of those people with other people. We know that there's no way that we'll ever know those things. They're never going to report back to us, here's the impact you've made, and here's a spreadsheet with all the impacts, you know. So I think we need to let go of the notion that we're going to see the results of our efforts as one sort of solution to that.
One measure of it, right?
And a measure, right?
Yeah, yep.
And some people criticize the notion of hope or the feeling of hope for this reason, because hope often is instrumentalist in that way. It requires that we see results I'll only have hope if I know that this is going to make a difference, you know? So I agree with that critique of hope, that particular critique. But yeah, I mean, to go to this particular question about, you know, as an educator, how do I shape other people? How do I help younger people do this? I would have them think through, what would it feel like to feel like you've done enough? What does that feel like? And I do a visualization exercise where I ask young people to visualize 10 years into the future or 20 years or whatever, and imagine a young person coming up to them and thanking them for the work that they've done. And what is it that they've done? Like, what is it, when they hear that from somebody, it could be their kid or a grandkid or just some kid in the neighborhood or whatever. I asked them to visualize what it smells like and feels like and looks like, the whole thing, right? We do like a virtual reality moment, right? Because it turns out virtual reality is a really, really great way to viscerally get people to imagine things, and the imagination is key to doing any of this work, right? So if you get them there imagining what they had done, they can often draw the dots backwards from that, just like the Steve Jobs point you just made earlier. Draw the dots backwards and say, aha, the thing that I'm going to contribute to this, the thing that's going to kick this off for me is whatever, and then fill in the blank, right? And so that imaginative exercise, that visualization exercise, can get young people to let go of caring whether or not it's going to make a difference and focus in on what's going to feel like it's giving them a sense of purpose. They can wake up in the morning and go to bed at night. That's my test. That's my litmus test. Can I get up and do I want to get up in the morning and face this stuff? And am I okay enough with it that I can go to bed at night? Yeah. Right. So there's sort of both, you know.
Exactly. That's really awesome. Right. Can I let it go enough that I can go to sleep?
Yeah. Does it keep me up? Is it that upsetting to me and I'm just never going to let it go? Well, that is not a lifetime. You've not dialed it in quite right at the right scale and the right kind of work yet if you can't go to bed at night and you can't get up in the morning. So that's a litmus test for finding that work for yourself.
Yeah. And then, Sarah, I'm also reminded as you're talking about this, the idea that, again, kind of going back to the dominant culture and what school systems teach us and all of those things that have programmed us is we're kind of used to that transactional piece, right? Mm-hmm. Like if I do this, I'm going to see the results, or if I and it just doesn't work that way, right?
Yeah.
It's all so much more connected. And
this is where I believe that social movements of the past and continuing like social justice movements, I'm thinking here about BLM and the long tradition of civil rights. I'm thinking about the feminist movement. I'm thinking about the American Indian movement and the current indigenous environmental justice movements that are happening. These movements know. The leaders of these movements have great quotes that they share. The wisdom of these experiences all tell us that you simply do the work as an end in itself. You don't do it because it's a means to an end. And if you feel like it's a means to an end and that's why you're doing it, you will give up. You will your energy for it will deflate. Robert Bullard famously says, "This is a sprint, not a marathon." I mean, there's you can find beautiful quotes from all of these leaders that surprise me. That I may not get there with you, right? It's not going to happen in your lifetime potentially, right? And this notion that we're doing it because we're part of a collective. I'm not doing it for my ego. I'm not doing it to see the stuff myself and pat myself on the back and say, you did it. The revolution's never going to happen. We're never going to see that. That's not the point, right? So to investigate, this goes back to the question about helping students, help them investigate what they need to feel. Like, what's the point of the work? What will they ever feel like they've done enough? Probably never not. So then what, right? Then what do we do? And how do we accept this as just a lifetime of work that we have to feel some satisfaction with,
Hey, and then let's also talk for just a minute about the flip side of that, because I've been talking to some older friends who say, wait a minute, I've failed you. Like, what world? I've been working my entire life for civil rights, and what have I left you? And so let's talk about, folks at the end of their life to know that towards the end of their life, that's also not the point, right?
Yeah. And I feel that way. I already feel that way, and I'm not that old. But I have little kids, so I'm always like, oh my, what are we doing?
Right.
So the responsibility to pet future generations is a really great motivation. It's a really great impetus. But of course, if you feel like by the time you're the sun's setting for you, if you feel like you're not seeing anything, it can be very discouraging. Yeah, I fully appreciate that.
Right.
But again, not in our lifetimes. And these things go like this. The arc of the moral universe is not like a clear, it's not like it's like this.
Yeah.
So you just, and frankly, even if, and this is something I don't share with a lot of people because I feel like it's one of those things where it's like, oh, Sarah, that could be taken the wrong way. But even if, worst case scenario, this doesn't end well and we're not going anywhere good, even if we have no guarantee of the moral universe bending towards justice, even if we have no guarantee that we'll stave off the worst of climate change, let's say the worst case scenario happens on all these fronts. Does that mean that I stop doing it?
Oh, exactly. No, believe me, I have that very philosophy in my mind when I live my life.
I mean, do I have to have guarantees of that to make it feel worthwhile? No, for me. And I think it's helped me letting go of that instrumentalism or that faith of it has to go that way has actually been very liberating for me, right? I can do the work because it's satisfying, and I find this goes to something else I want to bring up that I haven't talked about at all, but it's from the book, that we really need to redefine in the environmental movement as a movement of pleasure and desire, not one of self-deprivation, denial, self-denial, pleasure denial. And this notion that
fun and joyful, it's great work. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that there's a performance of grimness and despair that people feel like they have to do to be perceived as taking the work seriously enough. And I think we need to really fight against that, and find the people who find the most joy and delight and preciousness in the world are the people who have really reckoned with death, right? There's a reason for that. The people who have really faced mortality of the planet or of themselves or whatever are the ones who can really kind of say, okay, I'm doing this, I'm going to engage in this work and I'm going to find preciousness in it and pleasure and cherish every minute of it, because for some other reason, because it's the only one I got, right? This is the
Right.
only minute in life I got. So Mary Oliver beautifully says, what will you do with your one wild and precious life? And that chokes me up to think about it, right? It's like, oh, this is all we have, so am I going to let the fact that it isn't going to add up to anything stop me? No way.
Right. So I also want to, Nicole, thank you very much for pointing out that the BLM shorthand maybe is not that we should be saying Black Lives Matter movement.
Thank you.
Yep, exactly. That's
Sorry.
excellent. Thank you for pointing that out. Yep, exactly. Fast talker. And then the other thing, so Sarah, we're coming towards the end of the hour, and we will end at the top of the hour for everybody who's the other thing about all this Zooming stuff is there's like zero transition. We always end on time anyway, but like one meeting ends at 1 and the other one starts at 1. It's like, wow.
And you don't move your body. Your body's in the same place.
Right, exactly. Yes, so I encourage you all to stand up and walk around a little bit, stretch, touch your toes. So I also want to say that we did a Facebook Live with you, Sarah, before, and we will put together, Sarah, I'll ask you again to just, I think after the last time we asked you for a book list or your syllabus, and we can call from that, because people have been saying, hey, I'd love to get a list of those books that you mentioned, and some people are familiar with them, and for some people they're new.
Yeah, sorry.
Well.
I'll try to look back through the chat and make sure I lift those things.
We got
okay.
We're good. I was being the voice of
great.
for folks.
Thank you.
And maybe Sarah, just is there any kind of final 30-second wrap up that you want to give to this? And
yeah, of course.
And certainly say the name of your book again.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so my book is called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet. And it's really written for young people in the Gen Z, what I call the climate generation. So I'm hoping folks who are here, who know those types of people or who are those types of people will find something useful in that. And the final comment I'd say is that since I wrote the book, we've now encountered the pandemic, and we've also had the murder of George Floyd and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives. And this has raised much more to the foreground this notion of climate justice, not just climate change. And I think this is a really important moment for us to do that kind of reckoning in environmental circles. How is it that the environmental movement and the climate movement have actually been very embroiled in white supremacy? And how is it that some of the things like climate anxiety and intense emotional affect around environmental urgency can actually lead a lot of white people towards doing pretty what could even go as far as eco-fascist type of stuff. And so I want to acknowledge that the grief and the anxiety are legitimate, but that we've seen in El Paso and we've seen on January 6th, that there's a climate dimension to some of the violence and some of the reactions that we're seeing. And so given the reckoning that's happening in this country around the pandemic and race and Black Lives Matter, I really want to pin that we have a lot of work as an environmental community to do on racial reckoning. And the pandemic is a proxy for climate change and how it's impacting brown and Black lives so much more than it is impacting white people. Mm-hmm. In parts of LA where there's 98% Black and brown people, there's 1 out of 400 deaths versus Beverly Hills, which is 1 out of 4,000 deaths for COVID. So the way that this is unevenly impacting people, the same way environmental justice issues have long been known to do so, so too will climate change. And so we really do need to think of climate change as a climate justice movement. And I really want to leave on that note that let's turn all that affect of despair and anxiety into coalition building. So
absolutely. I look forward to building continued coalitions with you. Thank you so much for spending the last hour with us. Thank you to all of you online. Really wonderful to be with you. Really appreciate you spending your time with us. Sarah, again, thank you so much. The Stewardship Network will be back again on the second Wednesday in March, which is also on the 12th. I think that's the way these go. No, the 10th. It will also be then. We look forward to being with you. Thanks so much. And we'll share with you a book list.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thanks. Take care.